Hello and welcome to the Weekend Essay Podcast. I'm Kimberly Donder, Digital Content Manager, and in this week's Weekend Essay Podcast, we have feature writer Amanda Newman Smith asking, does evening up the score undermine diversity and inclusion? Take it away, Amanda.
I don't believe in astrology, but the characteristics of my star sign are broadly accurate in describing my personality. I'm a Libra represented by the scales of justice. It's accurate to the extent I do have a bee in my bonnet about fairness, and this sometimes lands me in bother. For example, I took myself out of a job with a previous employer who had expected our team to do what was essentially homework over the Millennium New Year. I'd been ill in bed while my friends were partying, and on my return to work, I got a dressing down from my manager in front of my colleagues for not doing my assigned task. Outraged at the unfairness of it, I defended myself. Would you have done it if you'd been ill, I asked, which was obviously the wrong thing to say, as my contract wasn't renewed. I was not exactly distraught at this, as I'd been on the end of various injustices in the brief period I'd held this job. A friend and I would always get the very early or graveyard shifts on the rota, while a colleague who was friendly with our line manager always got the coveted 9 to 5s. This colleague was even allowed a day off work to console a friend who had split up with her boyfriend. As a Libra, I'm also supposed to find it difficult to make up my mind. I wouldn't say this is 100% accurate, but I often soften my stance on something because I start seeing both sides of an issue. Even when money marketing readers don't agree with what I've written and use our comment sections to present an opposing view, I do see where they're coming from, which feeds into my future thinking. One reader comment got me thinking about the way we, as a society, approach diversity and inclusion. More specifically, in trying to even up the score for underrepresented groups, do we undermine our commitment to diversity and inclusion? Or are those who take this view just part of the problem? I've written an article about how the St James's Place Academy wants to bring people into the advice profession that are underrepresented in it. One online commentator pointed out that, as a female reporter, I'd included case studies of 2 female SJP advisors, but no men. The reader basically wanted to know how that is consistent with diversity and inclusion. It is an interesting point, and I've heard different versions of it in recent years from both men and women in the advice industry. Some female advisors I've spoken to don't like going to women in financial advice events and awards ceremonies because they feel that excluding men does nothing to improve opportunities for women. Some have had great male mentors that have nurtured their careers, so they don't want to do anything that separates the profession along gender lines. I understand that. Men and women should work together. And if women have felt marginalised, how does doing the same to men make things better? 2 wrongs don't make a right, but there's always the other side of the story. I know a couple of all-female advice firms that have come together by default, not design, as the best applicants for the jobs happen to be female. It's an argument that I've heard from advice firms to justify why they have no female advisors or few female staff in other roles. We pick the best person for the job. We don't do it by quota. That's fair enough, as long as we're being consistent. But when it comes to female-only firms, some people take that argument with a pinch of salt, believing it must have been a deliberate move to employ all women. They wonder how else it would be possible for an advice firm to employ no men. And how can a firm that employs no men seriously put themselves forward for awards that recognise diversity and inclusion in financial services, as one of these firms did, and got criticised for? Aren't they undermining the very thing they are championing? It's a topic that football fans who have been watching the BBC's coverage of the Women's Euro Championships may be familiar with. A couple of weeks ago, Lord Sugar used Twitter to complain about what he saw as a lack of male commentators on the women's game, in contrast to men's game where, in his words, there's a symbolic female commentator. Lord Sugar's remarks attracted a lot of criticism, with some people saying he'd got it wrong, as BBC commentator Jonathan Pearce was covering the match he'd complained about. The row rumbled on into the following week, when Lord Sugar tweeted again, implying that his original tweet was why ex-Arsenal and England star Ian Wright commentated on a match 2 days later. Wright took to Twitter to say he'd been booked by the BBC a year in advance. Parity between the men's and women's game was clearly at the heart of this, but for me it diverted attention away from a bigger concern. Just 6 out of the 16 teams in the Women's Euros are coached by women. If less than half the men's Euro teams were coached by men, I dread to think of the comments on Twitter. Relating gender parity back to the advice profession, women are underrepresented, and to borrow a phrase I heard on TV, they need to see it to be it. Firms that show women they can build advice firms, be hired by advice firms, or become clients should be given a chance to raise their profile through awards that promote diversity, as that is what they're doing. That's not to elbow men out of the equation, of course. We need male participation in all these areas too. It's just that women have some catching up to do. And that's the overarching context that's often forgotten when people complain about underrepresented groups seeming to get preferential treatment over the majority. Going back to our reader who challenged my use of all-female case studies, male financial journalists have been writing articles all about other men for decades while nobody batted an eyelid. One female journalist writing about two women is a drop in the ocean in comparison. If I wrote exclusively about women in this profession, I agree there would be a problem. But this isn't the case. I'm currently in the middle of a feature about men's mental health, which focuses purely on men. Should I be ticked off for the lack of diversity in it? I don't think so. Women's mental health is obviously important too, but that is an article for another day. Would I object if a male reporter wanted to write about men's mental health on the basis that women were not getting a look in? Absolutely not. We need to be sensible about these things, not dogmatic. Back in 2019, Money Marketing signed up to the 50/50 project, an initiative started by the BBC in 2017 to increase female representation in news reporting. It means we monitor how often we feature female contributors to improve the gender balance. But one of the core principles of the 50/50 project is that the best contributor is always used, so you avoid the accusations of tokenism that can be levelled at anyone trying to make something more representative. Recently, I've been writing about women who started advice firms when they were at or nearing their 40s. Being a woman in my 40s myself, I was genuinely interested, but I cannot take credit for the idea. It was suggested by the wonderful Sheena Doherty, Senior Wealth Consultant at Sovereign Wealth, Halifax. She had noticed this was a trend, and when I looked into it, I saw women were launching businesses, not just advice firms, at a faster rate than men. Many of the women I spoke to talked about having greater confidence as they neared 40, which I'd expected to come from having years of work experience under your belt. But something that 149 Managing Director Gabrielle Beaumont said stuck in my mind. Beaumont leads the acquisition programme at 149, and for her that confidence is about saying no to acquisitions that aren't right and to people who are asking things of her. In my experience, many women struggle to say no because they don't want to disappoint people, or they feel they have to prove themselves to be superhuman, especially if trying to juggle a career with family responsibilities. The real challenge for women is juggling everything without burning out, said Beaumont, who looks after her 3-year-old daughter and runs the business without the help of a nanny. In the UK, women still do the majority of the domestic chores and are often the primary carers if they have families, even if they work outside the home. Beaumont and I talked about how this is not because men are not doing enough. The reason is cultural. I think it's important to recognise that when we talk about certain things being challenging for women or men, it's not because we're excluding the other gender or blaming them. It's often about holding a mirror up to the world we live in and saying, this is the way it is, these are the expectations I place upon myself, but is this fair? Women often put themselves under so much pressure trying to prove they have everything under control, professionally and personally. Being a hands-on parent, even while running a business, matters because we want our children to look back as adults and remember that we were there. Delegating some of this stuff where affordable is hard for women to do and is often accompanied by guilt. But when Beaumont's husband, who works in real estate, was in Singapore on business, he noticed things work differently there. There are a lot of female chief executives, and Beaumont says it's because they have no qualms about delegating childcare and housework. Men face different pressures, and that links back to the feature I'm writing on men's mental health. For a man to say they are struggling and need help can be difficult, as they can be socially conditioned to see it as a sign of weakness. Culturally, British men are expected to just get on with things. It's that stiff upper lip Brits are famous for. I think it's the perceptions of implied criticism that ruffle some people's feathers when we try to create a more level playing field. As if highlighting the challenges some people are facing because of the way things are automatically points the finger at those who are not experiencing the same things. Perhaps if more of us were willing to see the bigger picture and be less defensive, we would all have fewer problems.
Thank you, Amanda, for another great Weekend Essay podcast. We do hope that you enjoyed it. Please do keep up to date with all our new releases via Podbean, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and everywhere else you get your podcasts from. You can also keep up to date with all our new content published on the Money Marketing website, as well as our print edition, Money Marketing magazine, so make sure to subscribe. Follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram. See you next time.